Most discussions about the Korean War focus on strategic advances, brutal winters, and shifting front lines. Yet a lesser-known reality affected the very foundations of military infrastructure, the quality and preparation of timber used in construction. Engineers rushed to build bridges, barracks, and field hospitals, often sourcing lumber without proper attention to cutting or grain orientation. What few realize is that a centuries-old Scandinavian practice, known to the Vikings, could have prevented decades of warping and structural failures, but modern mills and expedient military supply chains largely ignored it. This Viking timber-cutting rule is not a relic. It's a lesson in understanding material behavior under pressure, and it had tangible consequences during and after the Korean War. If you're interested in uncovering the overlooked intersections of history, engineering, and survival, subscribe to History Matters. This channel focuses on the details that shaped outcomes, not just the headlines. The Korean War forced engineers to improvise with lumber under extreme conditions. The peninsula presented conditions that tested both materials and manpower. Extreme temperature swings, high humidity, and inconsistent supply lines meant that construction had to be rapid, often leaving wood inadequately seasoned or improperly cut. Engineers prioritized speed over structural longevity. Bridges erected across rivers, field hospitals assembled in rural valleys, and barracks erected in forward positions frequently used timber with inconsistent grain orientation. The result was predictable. Boards twisted, beams warped, and structures that were meant to be temporary often failed within months. The Vikings had solved this problem centuries earlier. Long before industrial sawmills, Scandinavian builders developed a system for cutting and selecting timber that maximized stability. They understood that wood behaves anisotropically. Its expansion and contraction differ along and across the grain. By felling trees in winter, orienting the trunk, and cutting planks perpendicular to natural stress lines, they produced boards less prone to twisting and cupping. They also accounted for moisture content, selecting straight, slow-growing trees and splitting them along the radial grain rather than sawing haphazardly. Structures built this way, longhouses, ships, and fortifications, could last decades, even centuries, without significant deformation. So, modern lumber mills, and actually military supply chains during the Korean War, rarely follow these time-tested principles. Industrial sawmills, they tend to prioritize sheer volume and uniformity rather than paying attention to subtle grain selection. Most of the time, logs are cut in ways that maximize yield, not stability. Boards might be sawn through tangential cuts, which makes planks cheaper to produce, but honestly, they're a lot more prone to warping as they dry out. Back during the Korean War, timber was sourced quickly, sometimes even shipped in from distant suppliers, and grain orientation was rarely inspected. Engineers and soldiers working with these boards ran into the consequences firsthand. Beams would bend under weight, floors developed gaps, and those temporary shelters, they needed constant maintenance. Proper timber selection and cutting, honestly, can prevent all of these issues. Applying the Viking principle means considering three factors: felling at the right time, understanding the tree's growth pattern, and cutting along stress lines that minimize future deformation. Trees felled in winter, for example, contain less sap, which reduces both shrinkage and the risk of rot. Choosing straight, slow-growth trunks ensures there are fewer knots and irregularities. And finally, cutting planks along radial lines helps distribute internal stress more evenly. Historical accounts from Scandinavian shipwrights really emphasize that boards cut in this way can stay dimensionally stable for decades, even when they're exposed to repeated environmental stress. The Korean War demonstrated the consequences of ignoring these lessons. Forward operating bases and bridges constructed hastily provide clear examples. At one supply route near the Imjin River, engineers used untreated, industrially cut lumber to erect a temporary bridge in early 1951. Within months, boards had twisted to the point that the structure required partial reconstruction. Barracks in mountainous regions displayed similar failures. Green timber twisted under humidity and cold, forcing soldiers to shore up floors and walls. Had these boards been cut following traditional grain-aware methods, structural failure would have been significantly delayed or avoided. Survival and field engineering principles reinforce these historical lessons. For soldiers, engineers, and later survivalists, understanding timber behavior underpins practical construction. Wood is not simply a building material, it is a living, reactive substance. Cutting and selecting it with care can mean the difference between a shelter that lasts through a harsh winter and one that collapses when stress peaks. In field operations, where replacement materials are scarce, applying these principles can directly affect operational readiness and troop safety. Post-war reconstruction amplified the issue. After the armistice, South Korea faced massive rebuilding challenges. Lumber left over from military stockpiles often failed sooner than expected. Bridges required reinforcement, and civilian housing built with industrially cut boards warped within years. The same Viking principles that would have improved wartime timber performance could have extended the longevity of these post-war structures. The lesson here is that technical knowledge, accumulated over centuries, remains relevant even in modern industrial contexts. Commanders and engineers learned to integrate practical solutions. In response to timber failures, military engineers began to adopt methods akin to traditional storage and cutting practices. Boards were occasionally air-dried prior to use, supports were added to minimize bending, and grain orientation was checked when possible. While they could not replicate centuries of Viking expertise, these incremental changes reduced structural failures and highlighted the value of respecting material behavior. The overlooked role of subtle engineering decisions shaped both wartime and peacetime outcomes. Histories of the Korean War often focus on tactical victories or failures, yet material decisions, how timber was cut, stored, and applied, shaped the durability of infrastructure, the efficiency of supply chains, and the comfort and safety of soldiers. These choices ripple outward, influencing operational capability, post-war recovery, and even the adoption of engineering doctrines in later conflicts. Understanding these details informs both historical and practical insight. For historians, it underscores the value of looking beyond combat statistics. For survivalists or engineers, it provides a concrete framework for evaluating material reliability under stress. Proper timber selection, cutting, and storage are as much about preparation and foresight as they are about construction technique. The Viking example demonstrates that centuries-old knowledge, when applied correctly, can mitigate predictable risks even in modern or wartime settings. Remembering these lessons matters for both history and preparedness. The Korean War teaches that rapid construction, if uninformed by material science, incurs hidden costs. Structures fail, resources are wasted, and human effort is diverted to repairs. By studying practices like Viking timber cutting, we gain insight into how foresight and knowledge influence outcomes in both historical and survival contexts. If uncovering these overlooked historical decisions and their long-term consequences is valuable to you, subscribe to History Matters. Sharing this video ensures that nuanced insights about engineering, survival, and human foresight reach those who want more than surface-level history. The story of timber cutting is a reminder that in both war and peace, understanding the materials we rely on can shape outcomes for decades. Or